My pleasure to welcome you here on behalf of CGSR, but also the Office of Defense Coordination, which is our co-sponsor today of this event. Our topic, as you know, is the Trump administration in the Middle East. The Trump administration gets a lot of credit for mostly its departures in policy from preceding administrations of both stripes, and these departures driven home by the withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and from and the move of the embassy in Israel as two potent illustrations of the changes in policy. But of course, there's an awful lot of continuity in American policy, and the Trump administration approach reflects a good deal of continuity with prior administrations in terms of dealing with the challenges of peace and security in the Middle East. And our focus today in this session is on trying to understand these different elements of change and continuity in American policy. We're grateful to have you here today with us to start off this discussion for us. Thank you. Dr. Gause is from Texas A&M University, where he is in the Bush School of Government and Public Service, serves as chair of International Affairs and as head of the Department of International Affairs. His research focus through a career in academia is on international politics of the Middle East, particularly the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speaker.
Thanks, Brad. Howdy. There we go. That's the way we start things at Texas A&M. We start with a howdy. I see a number of alums of the program who spent some time with us in College Station. They were the ones leading you in the howdies, I'm sure. But as Brad said, we'll have a session at 1 o'clock today to talk about the opportunities for professional development and education in our summer program in College Station. You haven't really lived until you've spent a summer in College Station. Those, you can ask the alums, they'll tell you about that. But I want to talk right now about the Trump administration in the Middle East, and I want to make a somewhat counterintuitive argument that the Trump administration, although it has marked a departure in American foreign policy approaches in a wide range of policies, actually represents more continuity in the Middle East than is normally appreciated. But I then want to kind of fold that back and ask why. Why is it that this president, who said he was going to come in and break all the crockery, that he was going to put America first, that who was incredibly critical of American policy in the Middle East up to the 2016 election, hasn't changed things in the Middle East? And I'll draw a bit of a comparison to the Obama administration, where, as I've kind of indicated, I think there's a lot more continuities in the approach to the Middle East, and raises the much more interesting question in many ways, why is it that both of these guys, who came in rejecting what had been American policy in the Middle East, ended up, in effect, continuing it? So, on we go. So how different is Donald Trump? Well, we have this sense that he's developed a brand new relationship with Saudi Arabia, the magic orb, right? That he's more pro-Israeli than preceding presidents, and that he's kind of taking a new approach to the region. But I think that that's just plain wrong. I think it's just plain wrong, right? When the president campaigned, his main thing that he talked about in the Middle East was counterterrorism, how we were going to beat the you-know-what out of ISIS, how we were going to unleash the power of the American military on that. But at the same time, he was extremely critical of the war in Iraq in 2003 and spoke about a reluctance to get involved with serious military commitments in the region. In that, he was not that different from Barack Obama when Obama campaigned in 2008, right? Afghanistan, right? President Trump talked about what a waste it was. right? How dumb it was. He lumped it in with the Iraq War. Well, what did he do? He didn't draw troops out of Afghanistan. He increased the number of troops in Afghanistan, right? And famously said, in one of the few times where you might think that the weight of the office actually kind of, he felt the weight of the office, he said in his televised speech that issues look different when you're sitting in the Oval Office than they do otherwise. Syria, I think, is an extremely good example of these continuities, right? The president came in and very quickly launched missile strikes on Damascus, right? When credible reports of the use of chemical weapons, which of course the Syrians had used before against rebels, their opponents in the civil war. Plenty of credible reports of that, but in the Trump administration, when credible reports emerged of the use of chemical weapons, the president launched missile strikes. Wow, this is different. President Obama didn't do that. But there was no follow-up. There was no effort to actually try to leverage this new willingness to use force in Syria into some kind of new diplomatic stance, into some kind of press for a negotiated end to the civil war. It was literally a one-off. It was literally a one-off. Right? What did President Trump do in Syria? Well, he introduced more troops into Syria, but not to affect the Syrian civil war, but in the counterterrorism campaign against ISIS. And that was very similar to what President Obama had done in Iraq, when he pulled the troops out of Iraq and then sent some back in when ISIS looked like it might threaten to come south toward Baghdad after it took over Mosul. Right? Saudi Arabia. I'll talk more about this later. I mean, it's of course much in the news. But President Trump's relationship with the Saudis has been highlighted in recent months after the killing of the Saudi dissident journalist Jamal Khashoggi. And a lot of questions have been raised. What's the relationship between Trump and Saudi Arabia? And I don't know all of the rationales for the president's very close relationship with the Saudis, and I have some questions about it, but it's not unusual. Every American president has had this close relationship with Saudi Arabia. Right? Every American president has done that. Every American president in the modern era, right, even during times when the Saudis and the Americans were on different sides of the issues. Right? I'm old enough to remember the 1973 oil embargo, right, which was an enormously hostile act by Saudi Arabia toward us. And what happened? The Nixon and then Ford administrations worked very hard to sustain the relationship with Saudi Arabia. 9/11. The George W. Bush administration worked extremely hard to sustain the relationship with Saudi Arabia at a time when there was enormous public questioning in the United States about just who this country is and just what role they had, with 15 of the 19 hijackers being from Saudi Arabia, and of course Osama bin Laden being from Saudi Arabia. People say that President Obama allowed the relationship with Saudi Arabia to deteriorate. Except for the fact that it was the Obama administration, not the Trump administration, that supported the Saudi intervention in the Yemen war, which began in 2015. So it seems to me that the case for the continuities here are extremely strong. Now, the differences. The two big things, and Brad mentioned them in the intro, the end of the JCPOA, and that was a big thing. And that's the one exception, where I think that the Trump administration policy on the Middle East is fundamentally different from the Obama administration's policy. But I'll make the argument that Obama's the outlier, not Trump. In fact, the Trump administration's policy of returning to a hostile posture toward the Islamic Republic of Iran is much more consistent with the course of American policy since 1979 than the Obama administration's effort to do a reach out to Iran. And I'll talk about that more. The movement of the embassy, yes, that's a serious change. But I'll argue in a moment that it doesn't really change anything on the ground. So the big difference is Iran in the Trump administration approach toward the Middle East when compared to the Obama administration. But I would argue that it's a return to what had been a pretty consistent American policy of hostility toward the Islamic Republic since 1979. That's the Middle East, just in case anybody needs to, quick refresher. I always put up maps when I teach my courses, and I tell the students, you're going to be looking at me, you're going to get so sick and tired of looking at me that I'm always going to have a map up. So you can look at something else and maybe learn something when you don't want to look at me anymore. And we'll end up putting up the map when we go to questions. All right, military commitments. This is Raqqa, right? The headquarters of the Islamic State. I don't think I would have wanted to own property in Raqqa after what happened to it. And here's just a shot of the missile strikes on Syria back in 2017. The assault on Raqqa began under the Trump administration, but the emphasis on the fight against the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, or the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, whatever you want to call it. In Arabic, you call it Daesh, which is kind of insulting, but it's the acronym. Dawla al-Islamiyya fil Iraq wa Sham. Sham is Syria in Arabic. So if you want to be au courant and insult the jihadist group, just call them Daesh. And Secretary Kerry always pronounced it in the most horrible way that, you just knew that he was just reading a transliteration. But in any event, the assault on the Raqqa was simply an extension of what the Obama administration had been doing, right? Remember in 2014, right, ISIS had captured Mosul, the second or third largest city in Iraq, depending upon how one wants to count it, but a major city, had declared a caliphate and was moving down toward Baghdad. And Iraqi forces were scattering, and things looked really bad. And that's when the Obama administration reintroduced thousands of troops into Syria. Now, not the number of troops we had in Iraq under the George W. Bush administration, but introduced thousands of troops into Iraq to fend off and drive back the Islamic State. The Trump administration, right, Mr. Trump campaigned that he was going to take off the gloves, take off the restraints, and have a whole new approach to counterterrorism. But in fact, when they got into office, and particularly with his appointment of General Mattis, right, as Secretary of Defense, General Mattis, who had been the commander of Central Command, the U.S. military command in the Middle East, General Mattis saw that what they were doing was working. Right? It was a strategy that relied on local ground forces, in the case of Iraq, Iraqi army and popular militias. In the case of Syria, building up local forces, many of which were Kurdish Syrians, to fight against ISIS. Right? Support them from the air with American and allied air support. Support them on the ground with special forces, targeting, training, and people going into the fight with those forces. The Trump administration basically just kept doing that. They just kept doing it. Right? I think they increased the number of sorties. Right? They introduced American forces into Syria proper. Right? But they did it in the same general framework that the Obama administration did. Very few boots on the ground. Did I say something wrong? And it's very few boots on the ground, mostly air support in terms of kinetic military action. But most importantly, no expansion of the mission in Syria against Assad. right? In that sense, the Trump administration and the Obama administration were on exactly the same page. Right? That the removal of Bashar al-Assad from power was not a priority for the United States and not worth spending American blood and treasure on. Personally, I think they were right about that. I mean, we can have an argument about the consequences of the Syrian civil war, which have been enormous in Syria and the surrounding countries, obviously, but also in Europe with refugee flows. Not that all the refugees in Europe, not all the migrants into Europe are from Syria, but that was one of the issues that helped to spark the refugee flow. And as I mentioned before, President Trump, after campaigning on the idea that the Afghan conflict was an enormous waste of American resources, comes into office and increases the American troop levels in Afghanistan. Now, only by like 4,000 or 5,000. So we're not talking about a major surge of military forces there. And one wonders, you know, what difference 4,000 or 5,000 more troops can make in a 17-year-old war, where we previously had lots more troops and couldn't get our objectives achieved. That's something I want to come back to. So that's the Ritz-Carlton. And those of you who follow events in Saudi Arabia know that the Ritz-Carlton was turned into the most luxurious jail in the world last year in November of 2017, when the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman jailed about 300 of the elite of the business and political elites of the kingdom, including a number of his relatives in the ruling family. But when President Trump visited in March of 2017, they projected the face of the king and the face of the president on the Ritz-Carlton as part of the Saudis' efforts to show the president a good time when he came. And by all accounts, the president, who kind of likes the kind of neo-Baroque of the rich Arab oil states' architectural styles, was greatly impressed by his visage being flashed up on that very expensive building. The president's first visit as president, first foreign visit, was to Saudi Arabia. That's unprecedented. That was very unusual. I've been following Saudi Arabia for my entire academic career, and I was shocked. You know that presidents usually visit where first? Canada or Mexico. Almost always the first visit is to one of our neighbors, right? Just emphasizing how important our economic and political relations are with our neighbors. Well, you can imagine President Trump wouldn't choose Mexico or Canada for his first visit. But Saudi Arabia was still shocking, I think. Not only because of the obvious difference between the Saudis and the Americans on the whole issue of political values, but also because, I mean, the Saudis aren't a treaty ally. They're an extremely important country, right? But they're not a treaty ally. But I think it kind of signaled President Trump's transactional notion of foreign policy. It was a place that bought a lot of arms from the United States, and the president emphasized the economic benefits of good relations with Saudi Arabia. He announced $110 billion in sales of arms and other goods to Saudi Arabia while he was there. This was an enormous exaggeration. We sell about $14 billion worth of arms to Saudi Arabia a year. That's still a lot of money, but it's not 110. That was a lot of things that was already in the pipeline. There were a lot of things that were just paper commitments, not real contracts. But the president clearly was signaling that, right, the sale of arms was going to be a major element in his approach to the Middle East. But is that much different than any other president? Maybe President Trump emphasized it more, bragged about it more, exaggerated it more. But that's not that different. The United States has been selling billions of dollars of weapons to Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states since the 1970s. Right? Saudi Arabia was also, of course, a key to President Trump's anti-Iran strategy. Right? Iraq is a broken a broken actor. It's a playing field, not a player. Egypt, right, for decades, the major Arab state politically, the most populous Arab state, right, recovering from the convulsions that led to the downfall of the Mubarak regime, the political instability between the Muslim Brotherhood government of Mohammed Morsi and then the military coup that brought Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to power. This guy, that's the president of Egypt, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Egypt was not playing the geopolitical role in the region that it had for years. Really, Saudi Arabia was the only Arab state with the resources and the heft to be able to join in some kind of anti-Iranian coalition in the region. Without the Saudis, you don't have an anti-Iranian coalition in the region. And the president was very supportive of the Saudi move into Yemen, right? The Saudi campaign in Yemen. But again, that support from the United States began under President Obama. This was not a big shift. He also supported the Saudi Emirati boycott of Qatar, which is a clown show of depressing proportions. We can talk about that in questions, but since I think it's so irrelevant, I don't want to spend any time on it. Probably the thing that was most different about President Trump's approach to Saudi Arabia was his involvement in the politics within the family itself, within the ruling family. For decades, the United States has had a close relationship with Saudi Arabia and has basically been able to deal with whoever the family's internal processes produce as the leadership. But in President Trump's case, he and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, one of his closest advisors and a major player in his Middle East policies, particularly on Arab-Israeli questions, picked the king's son, Mohammed bin Salman, as a guy they could do business with, and promoted him. And it was just a few weeks after President Trump's visit in March 2017 that the king threw out the crown prince, a fellow named Mohammed bin Nayef, who was the interior minister of the country. In many ways, Washington's favorite Saudi. Mohammed bin Nayef was the key interlocutor for the United States on counterterrorism in Saudi Arabia as Minister of the Interior, which of course is the police and the secret police. Mohammed bin Nayef was key to the counterintelligence cooperation, counterterrorism cooperation, the intelligence cooperation and the counterterrorism cooperation that the United States and the Saudis had initiated after the 9/11 attacks. So Mohammed bin Nayef had been elevated to be crown prince. He was relatively young by Saudi standards. He was in his 50s. Remember, this is a land of octogenarian kings, at least in recent years. He was going to be the first king of his generation. It's going to be a big shift in the Saudi family power structure. And Washington was extremely happy with Mohammed bin Nayef. But just a few weeks after President Trump's visit, Mohammed bin Nayef is out, and Mohammed bin Salman, the young son of King Salman, was in and was made crown prince. The day after that, the New York Times ran a headline saying, "Trump gets his man." That kind of public acknowledgement of American involvement in the internal family politics of Saudi Arabia was really unprecedented. And as we can see in the fallout of the Jamal Khashoggi murder, has come back to some extent to bite the administration, the very close identification they had with MBS. So Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump with the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and his wife in front of the Embassy, United States of America in Jerusalem, Israel. Right. This was a bombshell, there's no question about it. The movement of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem had been something that every American president since, I think, Ronald Reagan had promised to do in his presidential campaign and then decided not to do when he got into office. Right? The move of the embassy to Jerusalem had been mandated by the Congress on numerous occasions and always put off by whoever was in the White House. Right? This is bipartisan. Both the Democratic and the Republican parties have in their party platforms, really since the 1990s, even into the 1980s, called for the move of the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So symbolically, this was a really big thing. But what did it change on the ground? Nothing. It changed nothing on the ground. Was the Palestinian Authority and Palestinian political groups, were they willing to cooperate with the Trump administration in the creation of a new peace plan? Maybe. The move of the embassy made that much less likely. Were the Israelis going to change anything as a result of the move of the embassy to Jerusalem? Not in the least. In fact, for someone who proclaims himself a great deal maker, the president got nothing for this move. No promises from Prime Minister Netanyahu to, say, limit settlement activity in the West Bank. No promises from Prime Minister Netanyahu to accept certain elements of a Trump peace plan, which we haven't seen yet. We still haven't seen the Trump Arab-Israeli plan, Palestinian-Israeli plan. But it's so interesting, right? Because President Trump came to office saying, literally, it would be the ultimate deal to get an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement, the ultimate deal. And he put his son-in-law in charge, right? He put Jared in charge. And in many ways, I'd say Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump are the president's most trusted and closest advisors. So it's not like he was trying to put the Arab-Israeli issue on the back burner. He was talking about this as a major initiative of the administration. And in that way, he's similar to every president since Richard Nixon. Every American president since Richard Nixon has basically had a plan for peace between Israel and the Arabs. And a couple of them had movement on that. Jimmy Carter and Camp David. George H.W. Bush in the wake of the Gulf War, being able to convene the big Madrid conference with Israel and the Palestinians and all the Arab states present. Bill Clinton with the Oslo Agreement between Israel and the PLO, the Jordanian-Israeli peace treaty. Barack Obama sent John Kerry to the Middle East, running around. Right? How many times in the second term? I think that the Trump administration's emphasis on Arab-Israeli, on an Arab-Israeli peace plan, is completely consistent with his predecessors, and the fact that he's probably not going to get anything done on it is also completely consistent with his predecessors. So why move the embassy to Jerusalem? One can argue that it's domestic politics, right? Important constituencies that were key to President Trump's electoral victory, like evangelical and fundamentalist Christians in the United States, are extremely supportive of this move. And a number of major donors to Mr. Trump's campaign, including Sheldon Adelson, were very supportive of this move. But this was going to happen anyway. This is going to happen anyway. And I would argue that it has had very, very little effect on anything on the ground. I don't think that whatever peace plan Mr. Kushner comes up with was going to get much support in the Palestinian community anyway. This just makes it even less likely. So our last two presidents, who could two people more different, right? Two approaches to foreign policy more different than Barack Obama and Donald Trump. But think about all the things that were similar about them in the Middle East. They both put an enormous emphasis on counterterrorism as the main American interest in the area. They were both very reluctant to commit forces in Syria. They were both supportive of the Saudi-Emirati war in Yemen. And they both produced peace plans, one of which went nowhere, on Arab-Israeli questions, one of which went nowhere, and the other of which will probably go nowhere. They're not that different, really. They're not that different. Here is the biggest difference, I think, between the Obama administration and the Trump administration, and it's Iran. President Obama made a major effort to engage Iran diplomatically. Right? The issue was the Iranian nuclear program, and the result was the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iranian agreement with the United States, the P5, Germany, and the EU, right, that they would accept limits on their nuclear program in exchange for the lifting of international sanctions that had been adopted by the UN Security Council, right, under President Obama's push to get multilateral sanctions on Iran. And this was, the Obama administration would argue, this was a good thing in and of itself. You know, walking the Iranians back from potential nuclear breakout. That was the case that they made for doing this. But there was also an underlying larger ambition in this, which you could read between the lines, and sometimes you could see in President Obama's interviews on the subject, and sometimes you could glean from hearing what people who worked on it and some of his aides were saying. They thought that if they could engage the Iranians in a successful way on JCPOA and show the Iranians that there was a benefit to them for engagement with the United States and these other international actors, that may encourage the famous moderates in the Iranian regime, right, to wrest some of the control of broader Iranian foreign policy from the quote-unquote radicals. Now, I put moderates and radicals in quotes because this is a very convenient binary we've used since 1979 to talk about factional politics in Iran. But there is some truth to it. Hassan Rouhani, who was president of Iran, still is president of Iran, the president of Iran for the negotiation of the JCPOA, and Javad Zarif, the foreign minister of Iran, seen there shaking John Kerry's hand. We're open to this engagement with the United States at some political risk to themselves. At some political risk to themselves. And bringing around the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, for whom anti-Americanism had been one of the core ideological commitments of the revolution, one of the things he inherited from his predecessor, Ayatollah Khomeini, the father of the revolution. And so this was a political risk for them. And it did indicate some amount of moderation in terms of foreign policies. The biggest criticism of JCPOA was not the actual, although people criticized the actual terms of the deal, but I think the biggest criticism, and perhaps the most telling one, was that it did nothing to restrain other kinds of Iranian foreign policy mischief. Intervention in Iraq, intervention in Syria, support for the Houthis in Yemen, right? Support for Hezbollah in Lebanon, support for Afghan militias and Iraqi militias, in essence creating states within states in these places on the model of Hezbollah, which was extremely successful for Iran. Right? And the Obama administration said, yeah, we couldn't do any of that stuff in this agreement. But the underlying argument was, if we can get them in on this one and strengthen these guys, that over time they would be able to contain this more, if you will, adventuresome, radical, destabilizing element of Iranian foreign policy. The counter-argument expressed in Congress when he was a congressman by Secretary of State Pompeo, and on Fox News when he was on Fox News by, that was a joke, but that's okay, by now National Security Advisor John Bolton, was that you gave Iran too much and didn't get enough in return. and that what we need to do is squeeze the Iranian regime. We need to go back to sanctions. We need to squeeze these guys to get them not just to walk away from any possibility of turning their nuclear program into a weapons program, but also to get them out of Syria, to get them out of Iraq, to get them out of Yemen, to get them out of Lebanon, and maybe to get them out of Tehran. Maybe to get them out of Tehran, right? The regime change element in the rhetoric of the Trump administration has been somewhat muted, but it's there. Secretary Tillerson, who we now understand was lazy as hell and dumb as a rock, actually testified before Congress while he was secretary that the policy of the Trump administration was to support those forces within Iran who want to struggle for their freedom. Now that's a regime, believe me, Iranians read that as regime change because they are hypersensitive about that. And that was one of the things the Obama administration basically walked back in the JCPOA negotiations. We have no regime change ambitions toward Iran. So I think given the fact that both Secretary Pompeo and National Security Advisor Bolton were on the record as favoring regime change in Iran before they took their current positions, Secretary Pompeo before he became CIA director, I think it's understandable where the Iranians might see regime change back on the table. So this is a huge change in America's approach to the region from the Obama administration. But just to reiterate, this is a return to the policies of the past, right? The George W. Bush administration put Iran in the axis of evil, even though, right, there was no evidence that Iran was involved in any of the 9/11 stuff, right? Iran was part of the axis of evil with North Korea and Iraq. George W. Bush, right, I'm sorry, Bill Clinton had the policy of dual containment in the 1990s, wanting to contain both Saddam Hussein's Iraq and Iran. The focus on Iran as a hostile, threatening power in the Middle East goes back to Jimmy Carter and the revolution. So in fact, President Trump is completely consistent in his hostile his hostile approach to Iran and the use of pressure against the Iranian regime through sanctions, completely consistent with American presidents from Jimmy Carter on. And the outlier here, the exception, the person who wasn't within that consistent train of American policy toward Iran was President Obama. All right. I'm sorry, there's a lot of words on this, and no pictures, but in many ways, I think this is the most important question. When the Obama administration came to office, they said they were going to pivot to Asia, right? Anybody remember the pivot to Asia? Right? We're going to pivot to Asia. When the Obama administration left power, there were 58,000 American troops in the Middle East. Now, that's fewer than when they came to power, right? Because we had over 100,000 troops in Iraq when President Obama came to power. But President Obama, who wanted to get out of the Middle East and pivot to Asia, right, found himself dragged back in, right? It's like Michael Corleone in Godfather 2, right? I keep trying to get out and they keep dragging me back in. President Trump campaigned in much the same way. He thought our engagements in the Middle East were stupid, right? That our policies in the Middle East were the JCPOA was the worst deal in history. He was critical of the Saudis. They're free riders, right? But once he got into office, there's been no pivot. There's been no reduction in American interest in the Middle East, right? In fact, there's been enormous concentration in the Trump foreign policy team on stuff to do in the Middle East. Why is it that people get elected saying they want to de-emphasize the Middle East and end up not doing it? Right? The last 3 elections, one could reasonably argue, were won by the candidate who was more dovish on Middle East questions. Obama versus McCain, that was pretty clear. Obama versus Romney, yeah, I think Romney was more hawkish on the Middle East. Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump, I think Hillary Clinton was more hawkish on the Middle East than Donald Trump. The last 3 presidential elections were won, well, with an asterisk with one of them, by the candidate who was more dovish on the Middle East. I don't think we have to think too hard about why. The experience of the Iraq War, I think, is understood by the vast majority of Americans as a huge mistake. As a huge mistake. Why should we get more involved in this tar pit, in this place where we just get sucked in and can't get out? Well, why do we get sucked in and can't get out? Well, oil, right? Oil's important. Everybody would agree. Oil's important. But look at the changes in the world oil market over the last 10 years, right? The United States has now regained its position as occasionally, from month to month, the world's largest oil producer, right? The whole decline of American oil production, which began in 1970, right, and was somewhat arrested, right, by the discoveries in Alaska, right? But American oil production had gone down and down and down until the mid-2000s, late 2000s, when the fracking revolution basically opened up enormous amounts of trapped crude that had been considered to be unavailable and was unavailable by existing technologies. So that technological change, in effect, doubled American oil production, right, from the end of the 20-aughts to now, 2018. Right? We were down around 5-6 million barrels a day of production, and now we're up around 11. A lot of people have looked at that and said, we don't need the Saudis anymore. We don't need them anymore. We got plenty of oil at home. I'm not sure that that is a completely convincing argument, but it's certainly an argument you hear quite a bit. So another reason why it shouldn't be hard to pivot away from the Middle East. So why can't we? Why can't we do that? Well, there's strong institutional and bureaucratic interests here. The military has poured concrete in the Middle East. Right? The United States military is all over the Middle East. A major base in Kuwait, Camp Arifjan. A huge naval base in Bahrain, a little island state in the Gulf, where the 5th Fleet has its home port. Right? Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, the largest American air base in the Middle East. Facilities, access agreements in the United Arab Emirates and Oman. Right? These are not temporary positions. Right? These are, I believe, in the United States military's conception, permanent bases. And one can argue that the strategy determines the bases, but many other people would argue that the bases determine the strategy. And so when you think about the people that President Trump, at least in his first year, had appointed to major foreign policy and White House positions, General Mattis as Secretary of Defense, right, who had to get a special waiver from Congress to take on that civilian role because he hadn't been out of uniform long enough according to the legal requirements. General McMaster, right? First General Flynn and then General Flynn, the National Security Advisor of 1,000 hours. But then General McMaster, right? General Kelly as Chief of Staff up until like tomorrow. These were all American generals who had led troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. And in the case of Mattis, at least, both places. They had sunk costs there, both emotional sunk costs and political sunk costs. So the sunk costs of the concrete with the sunk costs of the effort in Iraq and Afghanistan, I think, have tilted the American military toward a very Middle East-centric notion of their role in the world, or at least elements of the American military. Of course, there's also strong domestic interest, I mentioned in the Arab-Israeli context, for involvement in the Middle East. And there are continuing national interests there, there's no question about it. If you think terrorism is a big threat to the United States, and that's, of course, something that we could argue about. But politically, it would be hard to argue, to be a good politician and argue that terrorism was not a threat to the United States. That would take a lot of education of the American voter. So if you think terrorism is a big threat to American national interest and to American citizens, well, a lot of it stems from the Middle East. And if you're going to have an effective counterterrorism policy, you have to have local allies. And so people as distasteful as the Saudis, as difficult as the Egyptians, as headstrong as the Israelis, as, I'll go back and just say, difficult as the Turks, right? You need them if you're going to fight what you have defined as one of the major threats to American interests in the world. And oil, and I'll very briefly here. I think the argument that the increase in American oil production has made the Middle East less relevant is not a strong one. Because the United States was never interested in Middle East oil for itself, right? We imported very little oil from the Middle East, even at the height of our dependence on foreign oil. The Saudis always sent us about 1 million barrels a day, but they lost money doing that. They could have sold that for more in Asia. They sent it to us because they thought it would be part of keeping the political arrangement strong. And then the Saudis bought into the biggest refinery in South Texas, Motiva. Now they're 100% owners of it. And so they're basically sending their crude to their refinery to capture more profits up the production chain, right? But we've got most of our when we've imported oil, it's been from, you know, a hostile power like Canada, right? It's been from a hostile, and it's been from Mexico. It's been from Venezuela. It's been from West Africa, Nigeria, Guinea-Bissau. So we have never really cared about Middle East oil for us, right? When we started our relationship with Saudi Arabia way back in the 40s, at the end of World War II, we had all the oil that we needed and we were exporting it to people. It's because that oil was important for Europe and Asia that we thought it was strategically important, right? And that's still the case, right? That's still the case. So I think you can make an argument that oil remains a strategic commodity in which the United States has a global strategic interest, right? Not because of our consumption needs, but because of the reliance, particularly now in Asia, on Persian Gulf oil to meet their energy needs. So I'll just end on this because, you know, it's in the news. Jamal Khashoggi, a dissident Saudi journalist, of course, was murdered on the orders of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. Most likely, our intelligence services have, according to the newspapers, come to that conclusion with very high confidence. My own work on Saudi Arabia would lead me to believe that this kind of operation would not have been done by rogue elements, because it's a very hierarchical place and people don't do things without the okay from above. Jamal, he wasn't exactly a flaming regime opponent. He was a regime insider. He worked for the regime for years. He was a journalist. Then he went to work as a spokesperson for the Saudi embassy in London and then the Saudi embassy in Washington. His patron was Prince Turki Al Faisal, a former head of Saudi intelligence, Saudi foreign intelligence, a cousin of Mohammed bin Salman. He broke with Mohammed bin, although he was very supportive of Jamal was very supportive of Mohammed bin Salman at the beginning, very supportive of his social reforms, very supportive of the women driving thing, very supportive of him opening up the Saudi social life a bit from a very, very low bar, right? He felt that By the time he got to 2016, he felt that the crackdown that Mohammed bin Salman had been conducting against critics of the regime was such that he had to leave. And so he went to Washington, got a green card, special green card, so he could work for the Washington Post and wrote for the Post. Critical, but not calling for the overthrow of the regime or anything like that, but critical of, some of the policies of Mohammed bin Salman. And Jamal is one of the persons of the year for Time magazine. For those of you under 40 years old, magazines are paper publications that used to come in the mail every week. Lots of Americans used to read them. And being Time's what used to be called Man of the Year was a really big deal, really big news story, right? Who was the Man of the Year going to be, right? And it's not the greatest person in the world. Hitler was Man of the Year, right, in the 30s, and so it's not, Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979 was Man of the Year. It's the person who affected the news the most, right? That's Time's Person of the Year. This year they put journalists and beleaguered journalists. Jamal was one of them. The staff of that small newspaper in Annapolis that the guy killed a lot of people at was one of them. There were a couple of others. In any event, the killing of Jamal Khashoggi was just one of a series of reckless acts by the Crown Prince in foreign policy. Very briefly, he, in essence, kidnapped the Lebanese prime minister and made him resign in a strange speech from Riyadh in an effort to kind of create a political crisis in Lebanon that he thought would hurt Hezbollah. Completely backfired. In response to a very mildly critical tweet from the Canadian Foreign Ministry about human rights violations in Saudi Arabia, he declared relations with Canada cut, withdrew all the Saudi students who were in Canada about to start studying, thousands of them, and just went way overboard on that. The boycott of Qatar that he and the United Arab Emirates cooked up, which has been basically a failure. People will say the Yemen war also. I think that's in a different case, a different category. It's been unsuccessful and a drain on Saudi resources and a horrible mistake. But almost any Saudi leader would have intervened in the Yemen conflict because the Saudis have always, for decades, seen Yemen as their exclusive preserve. They don't want any other foreign power, particularly these days the Iranians, to gain a foothold in Yemen. But the conduct of the war in Yemen has been both unsuccessful and has brought discredit on the Saudis. The killing of Jamal kind of opened up what were strong anti-Saudi feelings in the Washington foreign policy establishment that have been there for a while. Congress, the think tanks. Everyone says, oh, the Saudis have a lot of money, they buy influence in Washington. They have a lot of money and they spend a lot of money in Washington and it does them absolutely no good, right? It does them absolutely no good. The only thing that they can get through is arms sales. And that's because all sorts of congressional districts benefit from arms sales. Right? Everything else in Congress about the Saudis goes against the Saudis. Before the Khashoggi thing, back in the end of 2016, some of you might remember JASTA, the Joint Action Against the Sponsors of Terrorism. This was a bill in Congress to allow American citizens to sue the Saudi government for damages from the 9/11 attacks, even though there's been no credible evidence presented that the Saudi government was involved in the 9/11 attacks. This passed overwhelmingly in both houses of Congress, bipartisan majorities. It was vetoed by President Obama and overridden by even larger majorities, right? Well, not larger majority, but overridden by 2/3 majorities in both the Senate and the House. If the Saudis can buy a lot of influence in Washington, we didn't see it at play there. But the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, who was a popular figure in circles in Washington, he was available to Washington journalists and think tank folks. He was known to congressional staffers. I think coalesced a lot of these feelings about Saudi Arabia. And I said the Trump White House was close to the Saudis, but every White House has been close to the Saudis. The problem for the Trump administration, and I'll end on this and open it up for questions, is that because the Trump administration has hitched itself so closely to the person of Mohammed bin Salman, right, and has been so publicly supportive of him and his rise to power within the Al Saud family, it becomes harder for the Trump administration to take what would be what we might call the normal American steps that a White House would do in answer to a grisly, horrific murder like this. The condemnation, the distancing for a while, right? That wouldn't rupture the whole relationship, but would express American distaste for what its ally had done. Harder for the Trump administration to do that because they're so tied to the person of MBS. So you don't have to look at me anymore, you can look at the map. And thank you for your attention.